I have to say that when I first heard from Robin and of Medtronic's generosity in sponsoring me to come here today, and thank you to Medtronics and to Robin for that, I kind of hesitated a little bit. She gave me an idea of who you are and of the topics that were going to be covered in it, and I thought, oh, I don't know, I don't know your world. This is language that I don't understand. But then as we talked more about the need for it, both in your organization and in your industry, and quite frankly, everywhere, this isn't unique to you, I started to see how much we have in common. And I realized that your work that is so desperately important is all about helping human people live better lives, right? What you do is you help people live healthier lives and longer lives. My work is sort of the same, because my job is to provide people with tools that they need to see other people accurately and to communicate respect for others, and therefore help other people live better lives. And when I kind of woke up to that, I suddenly realized, hang on, this really makes a lot of sense. And then I saw your theme, Deep Dive on Stroke. I love that. Oh, and what's going on at the aquarium tonight? I want to go, I can't, I'll be flying. But that sounds like such an appropriate way to create energy in this meeting. I think that's going to be great. And we're going to take a dive on unconscious bias here this morning for about a half an hour. And then we'll hope to have about 5 minutes to get comments. So be thinking about what you might want to ask. I'll also lurk around a little bit afterwards, and I'll be available to anyone by phone who wants to pursue it a little bit deeper, because we're not going to be able to do a deep dive this morning because of time. We're sort of going to skim across the surface, but everything I'm going to touch on the surface has a deeper ramification that all of us can work through time. I'm going to be giving you skills that you can apply through time and take deeper and deeper. So this is our goal. Our goal is to provide skills for becoming aware of and defeating bias that interfere with our ability to build a productive and inclusive work environment in whatever context that is. If it's as an association, if it's in a hospital setting, a medical center, a university, whatever it happens to be. How can we build an inclusive environment? And I'm going to touch a little bit in a minute about why that is so important, even beyond or in addition to the notion of treating people with respect. So in order to be absolutely positive that we know what I'm talking about, I'm going to put up a definition of bias. It may be something you feel like, well, I got a handle on what that is, but the culture seems to have torqued it a little bit, and I've discovered when I speak, I'll sometimes be getting into it deeper and deeper in a workshop setting, and all of a sudden I'll realize, hang on, everybody's thinking about this as something different than I am. So we need to make sure we're on the same page. This is my definition for bias. It's an inflexible, positive or negative, conscious or unconscious belief about a particular category of people, right? Now, there is hidden in this, by the way, an answer to one of your CME tests, so just notice it, look carefully at the definition, a little bit of a clue there. A couple of things I want to call attention to. Inflexible. A bias is not what I call a working generality. You work with different cultures, all of you, many different cultures representative in this room. Gender differences, age differences, national origin differences, all of that. As we learn to work together, as we learn to care for patients of diverse backgrounds, we learn stuff, right? We study those differences, maybe they're physiological differences, maybe they're cultural differences, maybe they're how we communicate differences, how we respond to pain differences. We study them. But as we study them, we know, because we're smart, we don't let our brains trick us into feeling that that knowledge that we have about that group is absolutely inflexibly appropriate to every single patient we're going to encounter. We know it's flexible. We know it's a guideline. It's a starting point. Yeah, you know, some men are this way. Some people from South Asia are going to be that way. Some Americans are this way. Some aren't. It's a starting point. It's when it becomes inflexible, when you can no longer see the individual, that you have allowed our mischief maker brains that are so smart to mess us up. So we need that flexibility. Notice too, the word positive. That might surprise you a little bit, because all biases, because they keep us from seeing an individual for who an individual is, because they keep us maybe from seeing that a particular individual's paper is better than another individual's paper, that a person would be better for a panel than someone else, because they block us from seeing that, because it affects a hiring decision. They're all bad. But sometimes the content of that inflexible belief is a good characteristic. And because we're nice people, a lot of us have those kinds of biases that are positive characteristics. And because we're nice people, we feel like they're okay. Well, our culture, speaking of US culture for the moment, our US culture is riddled with positive biases. You know, all Asians are good at math, right? All women are nurturing. You know, all, I don't know, black men are athletic, okay? I mean, every single, you know, all those things, all gay men are artistic, right? You know what I'm talking about here, don't you? And I want to caution you, as we go through this material and as you dive deeper into it on your own, watch for those. Watch for them, because they, like anything else, are going to keep you from seeing a person for who they are. Even though they're positive, they're still a problem. So, a couple of basics to get us started here. Keep in mind as we go through this, we've all been the object of bias. There's men in this room that people have assumed are sexist just because they're men. You know, there's people from other countries who, because of their accent, people feel they're not that educated. There are people in this room who came from particular universities, particular parts of the country, when maybe they're looked at as being lesser, or back to the positive biases, as better because of a bias. Every single person in this room, there's women that have been dismissed and interrupted. There's men who have been assumed to be a particular way. There's whole groups that have been assumed to be racist. All of those things are biases. So as we do this, think of yourself in the times it's happened to you. And it has, to greater or lesser degrees of severity and consequence. Think about that and how nasty it was. Even if it was irritating, even if it didn't cost you a job or an opportunity, it doesn't feel good, and it doesn't help you move forward and contribute to the field. So you don't have to admit it to anybody, but think about the times when it's happened to you, and I think that helps wake us up a little bit to not doing it to others. Keep in mind too, as we go through this, having a bias does not make you a bad person. You know, if it did, I'm doomed, okay? I haven't got time to share my biases, but I had one coming in from the airport, right? I watched myself jump to conclusions about someone that I was with. And by the time I was with that person for 10 minutes, I just could have kicked myself. I was so off, I was so wrong, and I was so sure that person was going to be the way I thought they were. It's a constant thing that has to do with awareness that we'll get into. But when you notice a bias in yourself, and that's the first technique we're going to talk about, don't kick yourself. Use it as a diagnosis. You know, you cannot help a patient unless you understand what is going on with them. And so you see what the problem is, and then you get on with fixing it. That's all we're talking about here, is waking up to it. If you kick yourself for it, see what's going to happen is you're not going to want to look at them, right? And so that's going to keep us from doing it. So everyone's got them, sure. There are biases that are deeply, culturally, and universally destructive, and you know what I'm talking about, that are really, really nasty, that nasty people have. I'm not really talking about that here. I'm talking about I'll call them the nice guy biases. Biases keep us from seeing people accurately. That's the bottom line. positively or negatively. We can't see who that person is, and that's where the brain starts to trick us, and they interfere with our ability to treat others with respect, and therefore to create this truly inclusive workplace where everyone of all backgrounds has the opportunity to share their expertise at meetings like this, within individual meetings, within your workplace, that you've got all those different ways of thinking. Now, why does this matter? This matters for a reason that you might not be aware of. I've been in this field, 25 years, kicking around a little longer than that. It used to be, when we first started talking about this stuff, that we talked a lot about the value of a diverse work environment. Again, whether it's a workplace or a community, whatever it was. And that was true. We saw it. It was stimulating to have people that were different. It was fair. It was the right thing to do. But here's what's happened since then. Study after study after study after study from very different types of universities and sources have shown that, in fact, any work environment that is peopled by people who think differently is going to be more innovative, and that's the end of the story. It's a fact. Now, why? It's not just that people bring different ideas, and that's true. It's not just that people are educated in different parts of the world or at different universities, but that's true. It's not just that people express themselves differently, but that's true. Frankly, sometimes the reason it's more innovative is because of the tension that it creates. I'm thinking right this second of a time when I was at a meeting with a group of people trying to design a program. And it was like 6 people. I swear, all of them looked exactly like me, right? It was blonde women in blazers. You know, it was like, look around, oh, look, it's a club, the Blazer Club. I mean, along with the blonde women in blazers, we just looked at the world. Our backgrounds were the same. We had roughly the same level of education, and we looked at the world very similarly. We could not solve this problem that we were working on for the life of us. And we're not stupid. We were educated. We had, we communicated well. And then one of the women, after meeting, when we weren't getting anywhere, she said, you know what? I know this guy, okay? And I said, okay, what guy do you know? And she said, well, there's this guy I know, and what he does, his job is to go into problem-solving situations and help torque it, help shake us up a little bit, help get people to the conclusion that they want. And this was my show, by the way. I was the manager of it. I was in charge of it. And frankly, I tend to be a little territorial, so I kind of resisted it. It was like, okay, fine. All right, let's bring this guy in. All right, next meeting, this guy comes in. I did not like that guy one little bit. He came in, I'm doing things, he's a little arrogant, he doesn't understand, whatever, okay? He gave some ideas for this hour, but basically he sat there, right? And then he would comment a little bit. He left. We took a break. We got back together again, and we cracked it. Not because of anything he said, not his idea. We cracked it because he chemically changed the conversation in the room. Each of us, because we didn't really quite understand what he was saying, had to wake up and begin to think harder. Each of us, because we didn't agree necessarily with what he was saying, had to pull together our arguments, right? And in the course of pulling together our arguments, we were thinking in a more complex way, and bam, there was the answer. Why? Because of the diversity of, in that case, really personality and background. This is what you're working toward. It's fair, it's right, but it's a practical thing that's real, and sometimes it's a little tense at first. Sometimes it's a little deliberate at first, but it's worth it. But it's our brains. Our brains can really mess us up with that. So, what can I share with you to do about all this? First of all, let's talk about becoming aware of our biases. This is going to seem really simplistic. I'm going to own that, but it works, all right? Some years ago, I was doing one of my programs at a winery in Sonoma County, California. Poor me, I mean, my life's hell, right? I get to go to these places. And I had done the workshop on this stuff, and I was walking back to my room. And as I walked there, the route took me on a balcony. There was a railing, the balcony, that overlooked a large cocktail lounge, okay? So I'm walking this way, make a left, I can picture this moment, you know, it is in life sometimes. You just remember it. I'm walking this way, and I glance down into this big cocktail lounge, and I see all those little 5-foot round cocktail tables with the white cloths hanging to the floor. And I go, well, that's interesting. And then I saw a door open to the outside, and the light comes streaming in. I could see a big wheel of one of those big tour buses. And then I also saw a bunch of people streaming into the room and circling each of these tables and sitting down. And I looked down there and I noticed that all of these people were what you'd have to call elderly, 80, 90, 95 years old. And this thought popped into my brain. Quote, remember it, gee, I'm sure glad I'm not down there with them. Those conversations must be boring. Okay, Thiederman, you know, this is how you make your living. And you're going around, you talk about a bias, I'm sorry. It was deeply inflexible. It was every single person in that room because of their age. Forget the fact that they were probably professional people in order to be able to, to afford going to the wine country and doing the tours and all the rest of it. Forget all that. This isn't about logic. This is about this primal part of me. And I put down my laptop case and stopped and thought. I noticed that thought. I noticed it. And I need to begin to explore, is it possible for all of us to get in the habit of watching that first thought when it pops into your brain? And that's this clue number one to all this that I'm going to leave with you this morning. When you leave this room, I would ask you, start noticing what pops into your brain when you first encounter someone who's different from yourself. Just watch it. Don't make a big deal out of it, just watch it. Watch what pops into your brain when you see an application, or when you're making a choice about who to call on in a meeting, or who to hire, or who to give a position, who to give a promotion to, whatever it is. Or a patient coming in some particular cultural background. What's the first thought that pops into your brain? Notice it. It's a habit. I have to tell you, it gets obnoxious, by the way, because I do it all the time, and I'm going, oh gosh, there I go again. But it's keeping me alert to this mischief brain that's messing us up, okay? So, now, second step to that, though, how do you know that's a bias? Maybe it's just a thought. I don't know. Ask yourself a couple of questions. First question to ask yourself, was that thought an inflexible generality? Was it an all statement? And man, mine was. It was, oh, all those people are boring because of their age, okay? Very inflexible. It wasn't like you met someone who clearly had a particular characteristic because you talked to them, and then that's that individual. Was it inflexible? That's going to be a clue to a bias. Have you had a memorable positive or negative experience with the group of people in which the characteristic you thought of was manifested? Why ask that question to see if it's a bias? Because that's one of the many places that these inflexible beliefs come from. Intense experiences, usually. They may be positive, they may be negative, but that's where we learn them. So, you've had this first thought. Was it inflexible? Yeah, okay, I don't know this person. But secondly, where might I have learned it if it's a bias? Where might it have come from? And if you find, yep, and I've got stories I would share, I did, darn it, I hired that person. years ago, and they did not work out, or I put them on a panel and they had nothing to say, and everybody criticized their paper, and I looked bad because of it. Could it be that that's where my bias comes from? About one person who didn't do such a good job, maybe? One person? Or it could be positive, too. So ask that question. Thirdly, I like this one. You talk about tricking your brain out of doing what it's doing. This is powerful. Let's assume for the moment that you are at the grocery store. I hate going to the grocery store. I don't know if you feel the way I do. And I especially hate going to the grocery store when I have to stand in a long line, and when the clerk behind the cash register is inept at what they're doing. So let's assume for the moment you're like me, and you're rushing home from work, and you've stopped at the grocery store, you just want out of there, okay? You walk in, you stand at the back of the line, and as you wait in your impatience, you notice that the person who is behind the cash register is of some visible ethnicity. I don't care what it is. Doesn't matter. You just notice, okay, you can see they're of some visible ethnicity, fine, and gender too. And then you begin to notice that this person is really bad at their job. I mean, they're making mistakes on the change, they're putting the bread at the bottom of the bag and having to redo it, they're dropping things. I mean, they're just not good at it. And inside your head, we're back to the watching it thing, comes this thought. Geez, why do they hire those people? Okay? There's the bias, there's all those people are going to be boring. Got it? At that moment, just for the heck of it, just for the fun of it, switch them in your brain. Pretend, play with yourself. It's a game. Change them in your brain to some other ethnic group, or whatever, to someone who looks just like you. I don't care what it is, I'm not interested in that. Doesn't matter, just change them. And then ask yourself what you think. If at that point you think, why did they hire that person? You got a bias on your hands. Because you went from judging a whole group of people as all alike to just looking at the one person who was doing a bad job and they probably shouldn't have been hired, okay? Play this game with your brain. I know you're used to working with our brains and our systems in this hugely sophisticated way, and this is real different. We're a whole different deal we're doing here. But it's fascinating what you're going to learn, and it just gets to be a game and a habit. So watch that first thought, analyze it to see if it is or is not a bias. Is this going to get at those deeply rooted, deep things that come from trauma or that are spread around our culture? Maybe not. That's true. But most of the ones we have that interfere with our ability to make the right decisions as professionals, it's going to work through time. So, what else might we do? This is one of your CME questions, by the way. Can we use logic to weaken the foundation of the bias? So we've got, the primitive brain with spewing up all this trickster stuff, and then we've got our logical brain. Can one influence the other? And I won't go through all the studies for at this point, but yes, it can. So, what tools can you use? Ask 3 simple questions to crack the foundation about this bias. Was the source of your bias reliable? Back to that experience where maybe one time you hired someone from a particular group that did not work out and you looked bad. Back to that. Maybe a patient suffered because of it and you felt bad. Back to that. Was that source reliable? Also, how many people, this one gets funny. How many people do you actually know who conform to your bias? I mean know. I don't mean seen across a parking lot or heard a rumor about or saw on TV. I mean know. If we're back to that issue of gender, for example, how many women do you actually know who you actually know would not be good to be put in a leadership position or on a panel or publish a paper? How many do you know? How many those people who talk about all men being sexist, okay? How many men do you actually know for a fact who are sexist? It's gonna be this teeny weeny little number, okay? I remember when I was working on my first book, and I was doing some interviews, and I got this woman on the phone, and we were talking about biases, and she said, oh yeah, the world is riddled with bias, which it is. The world is riddled with bias. And I said, well, talk to me about that. And she said, well, I've been in the work world for 20 years. In the course of my 20 years, I've had 3 male bosses, and all 3 of them were blatantly sexist. And I said, oh my goodness, that's bad luck. That's bad. And then I said, well, how do you know that? I mean, what was it? Talk to me. And she, said some things that had happened, some of which were teeny, some of which were big and creepy, and others were, I didn't quite get it. And so we talked a little bit, and then I hung up the phone, and then I thought, well, hang on a second. She thinks all men are sexist, right? Because of these 3 men, right? So I went on the computer, I don't know how I did this. I figured out that there was roughly 20 million men in the United States of America who were in a position to be her boss in those 20 years, right? So then I thought, what's 3 out of 20 million? And I actually emailed my accountant, who's a friend, and he came back with 0.0006 or something like that. Now, of course, there's more than 3 sexist men on the planet. Come on, let's not be silly. But just the fact that she was sure it was all, and partly because she had traumatic experiences with these guys, but she created a bias out of that. And that's what we need to be so careful of. And finally, ask yourself, do you know any people who do not conform to your bias? What about all the people you know that are different from what your bias says? How many older people do I know who have, wow, who are the best conversationalists on the planet? How many people do I know? And as I analyzed it, I began to see that, well, wait a minute, you've got that one experience there, but that, in the past there was something, but how many others do you know? Wake up the logical part of your brain, okay? I used to do an activity, which I don't do, I'm hesitating because of time, just a second, I'm going to go ahead and tell this, which I don't do anymore because it kind of gets me in trouble, but years ago I had a workshop, it was in San Diego, California, and it was nurses. And at that time I did this activity of asking the group to tell me what biases they have, what biases do you have? And it can get a little twitchy, so I tend not to do that anymore. But this woman sitting all the way in the back row of that corner, I'll never forget it, she raised her hand and she said, I've got one, but mine's not a bias, mine's true. And I thought, okay, well, we're kind of off track here, but that's okay, hang it in there, hung in there with her. And I said, okay, what is it? What is that bias? What is that thing that you say is not a bias? And she says, well, I hate to say it, but all Mexicans are destructive. That's one reason I don't do it anymore. So I said, oh, okay. And so then I said to her, how do you know, right? Big question, how do you know? And she looked back at me and she said, well, I live in an all-Mexican neighborhood, and 2 weeks prior to this particular workshop, she'd been home alone one night, and 2 teenage boys from down the street had gotten drunk, and they'd come down, tried to break into her house, and then got angry and destroyed her front fence. Terrifying. And I said, that's awful, it must have been terrifying. And she said, it was awful. Root of the bias, where did it come from, right? But then I asked her another question. Don't forget this question. What about everyone else in the neighborhood? And she looked back at me completely guilelessly, like she didn't get what was happening. And she said, oh, they are wonderful people. I wouldn't live anywhere else. We go to church together, we have barbecues together, we take care of each other's kids, it's just great. So then I went after her in a nice way, and I said, how come then? When I asked you for a bias, you didn't say all Mexicans are wonderful people, which is equally ridiculous, of course. And she actually teared up on me a little bit, and she said, I can't believe I did that. She allowed that negativity of that one thing to color her perception of the whole neighborhood. Keep that in mind. You can get your brain working on your side if you use these wonderful brains that you've got. So finally, fake it till you make it. Clients don't like it when I use that phrase, but it really says it. This is Aristotle, social psychologist David Bem, saying and doing becomes believing. Now, you need that awareness to do it, it's true. You need that in this case from the beginning. But if we can act as if the bias does not exist, there's a very good chance that it will fade. Why does that happen? That works because of cognitive dissonance. If you believe something in your brain and you act as if it isn't, you act in a way that runs counter to that belief, something's got to change or theoretically you'll go mad. It's very uncomfortable. So if we believe something, we know we believe it, we know it's not cool, we're aware of it, we just can't seem to kick it, act as if it's not there, and there's a darn good chance that your attitude will start to fade. We also get more positive responses as we act as if it does not exist, and of the increased knowledge we gain as we treat people with more respect, as we hire more qualified people, as we give people exposure, as we listen to people's ideas that are qualified, we begin to get individual knowledge. So let me give you just a simple example, and this involves deliberately and consciously practicing counter-bias behaviors that are specific, observable by yourself. You know you're doing them, okay? This isn't, I'm going to be nicer, or I'm going to see people more accurately. It's like this, measurable and probably initially uncomfortable. Example, let's say that you manage meetings a couple of months, every month or so. And there are people on your staff that because of their background, whatever it is, you have a bias you're beginning to notice in yourself that maybe their ideas aren't going to be the best ideas. And you're under a lot of pressure. Maybe it's gender, maybe it's accent, maybe it's country, maybe it's the university, it doesn't matter. And you notice that in yourself. I'm just not really giving them a chance, but I'm still doing it, okay? So think about what behaviors that bias might be creating in you. It may mean you're not calling on them. It may mean you're not really listening to them. It may mean you're interrupting them when they speak because in your head, you're just kind of rushing ahead because of this bias. Try this just for the heck of it. Make a note of those behaviors and find physical, observable ways around it. Have an agenda so you're forced to call on anybody. Commit to yourself that you're going to take notes on what that person says. That's going to force you to listen. Okay? Or commit, you're going to ask at least one follow-up question. And commit, I won't interrupt anybody, no matter who. It can be my best friend, and my best friend may not mind it, but you're still not going to do it because it's a habit to give respect. And what starts to happen, sure, not every idea is going to be great, but you're going to start hearing them because you're going to have a chance to hear them, right? And that can gradually erode this bias. Now, I always say to audiences, this is a little bit like a cough. You know when you catch a cold and there's always that lingering cough afterwards and you can't get rid of it. I mean, it goes on for weeks and every night when the air gets moist or cold, you start coughing again. And it's always going to be there. That's it. I'm stuck with it. And then one day it's gone and you go, my golly, I'm not coughing anymore. That's what this is like. Fake it till you make it. Act as if you don't have this attitude, and you're going to turn around one day, and chances are, no guarantees, but if you're consistent, something good could happen. And just final to close. This is our wonderful poet, Maya Angelou. In minor ways we differ, in major we're the same. All this stuff, this diversity inclusion stuff, it has to do with having respect for who people are, while simultaneously, these do not compete, we begin to identify what we have in common. When I started this, I talked about the commonality we have at helping human beings. It's a big deal. There's always something in common. Let's value the difference, respect the difference, see individuals for who they are, and at the same time, without negating that, begin to find what we share. And in your work, what you share is mission that is of profound importance. So if Robin would like to come to the stage, or do you want to work from down there? It looks like we've got 5 minutes for any comments or questions. And again, I can be available to talk on the phone if you'd like.
Thank you, Dr. Thiederman, for that very wonderful and enlightening talk. I would like to audience, do you have any questions? I know I have one.
Okay.
If you feel like you are being judged or that others are perhaps influenced by biases, what is a way to approach the conversation without trying to alienate or insult someone?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a very good question. How do we approach someone whom we believe has a bias about us, or imagine someone else as well, without alienating? Thank you for saying that about the alienation. The mistake that I think we sometimes make is labeling. It is that classic good conversational skill, asked to be with someone in private. This has happened to me with audiences where people have felt alienated by something I said. My first response is, hang on a second, can you meet me out in the hall afterwards? And there's those nice chairs in the corner, and let's talk a little bit. And in the course of that, you're honoring their dignity and where they are, because you have to start there anyway, without going in and saying, you know, you're biased, you're racist, you're sexist, and then talk about how you feel after you've listened to what they are. I wager that can get a good conversation going about 75% of the time.
Excellent.
I had not heard before in the inclusion of the definition of bias, the inflexibility component. And I think in a lot of generalities and assumed that all of that was bias. I wondered where you came up with that distinction, or if you could elaborate on that a little bit.
Yeah, the distinction between a working generality, flexible generality, and an inflexible bias. I began to see that where that came from was when people I was consulting with would give me examples of, but wait, Americans do tend to be more punctual than people from Latin America in business. And I would notice that they were taking this inflexible thing that's perfectly valid as long as it's got many people, some people attached to it, and thinking of that as a bias. And what was happening was people were tossing out all this cross-cultural knowledge that we needed, because they kept thinking there was something wrong with believing it. Human beings, I think you know this, human beings want things concrete, right? We want everything in boxes. Folks, it ain't happening. And I think people really resist that. And I mean, I'm thinking, what's a quick example? I speak in England quite a little bit. When I go to England, the culture's different, the education system is different. This is changing quite a bit now. But when I first started there, I didn't know whether I was going to get an audience that was extremely participative, like they might be, or apt to be in the US, or one that was more accustomed to a more sort of respectful learning situation where you don't disagree with the teacher. So I would take essentially 2 different presentations with me, one with lots of extra material and one with lots of interactive, and work it as I needed to on the spot. So my working generality sometimes applied, sometimes didn't. Good question.
Thank you. Any other questions?
Thank you. If your perception about me, what he said was, some days you, correct me if I'm wrong, what he said was, some days you wake up not feeling well. And on those days, his perception of another person is going to be different, am I correct, on a day when you might be feeling well and maybe more optimistic and more secure, okay? That has to do with us being alert to the fact that, hang on, I'm not feeling very well, let's talk about it tomorrow. But it's less to do with the whole group. If you woke up one day thinking that all Americans are pushy, which a lot of us are, all Americans are pushy, and because you're in a bad mood and sensitive to it, then you're getting into bias territory. Then you kind of get that it's all reacting to an individual stuff. Yeah, just get a good night's rest. We'll be all right.
I think listening to you speak has really opened my mind. And I wonder if it would do us all a good service to, when we want to have a meeting or have a conference call, to open it with an acknowledgement that we may all have hidden biases and that there should be an openness in addressing it if someone feels that they are experiencing a bias, and open that line of communication so that we know that we have that potential.
Yes, and I'd like to add that to that, Robin, is being open to people expressing, giving permission, we'll say, on opportunity on a call to voice that they feel that they're not being treated with respect. But also, wouldn't it be wonderful if we could reach the point where all of us get in the call and call out our own biases as we're doing them, too? Then you're really rolling. Then you're really rolling there. It's all about taking care of the patient, isn't it, ultimately, and doing that as effectively, still better than you even do already, which is so lovely. Anything else for right now?
I have one more question since we're running out of time. How can we work on changing our work cultures? We get bias from our coworkers, patients, supervisors, and subordinates.
So what she's saying is that we get biases in all directions. Oh gosh, this is why I love doing it in healthcare, because patient biases towards you, I know, there's a whole huge thing there. And boy, that's an extremely broad question. I'm going to answer it in a glib way, and that is, let's start with ourselves. The more we can model that respect for others openly and our own foibles, the more apt other people are going to be to understand and begin to mirror it. And it's a step at a time. We can't pretend it's not. And I'm glad to talk about that in greater depth offline.
Thank you so much, Dr.
Thank you all
Thiederman.
so much. Thanks,
Thank
guys.
you.
Thanks for